Look, if we were doing this talk probably even a week ago, certainly 2 weeks ago, it would have been a talk very much about how the Labor Party had paved the way for, the likelihood, very, very high likelihood of Peter Dutton, being elected. And in that respect, it would have repeated what we've seen in many other places around the world in the way in which the Democrats, created the circumstances which allowed, Trump to come to power. And that's really the why we're talking about the AFD and Germany. The fact that the AFD became the second major party in the German Parliament was a shocking development, but which is indicative of what's happening across Europe. But the fact that as we sit here, the likelihood is we're going to have a minority Labor government doesn't alter that. We shouldn't be complacent about that. Doesn't alter the usefulness of actually going over, how the crisis in social democracy, the inability but the fact that social democracy has got no answers to the very, very deep crisis in capitalism is something that we need to take very seriously here. And I think it's instructive in one respect. I mean, a little while ago, Dutton thought by imitating Trump it was going to be to some advantage. It's turned out to be, not the case. But that's kind of, I think, a bit of an accident of history. But it's an indication of where, Dutton, the boost which Trump has actually given to the right, around the world. For a while, Dutton's attack on public service, the attack on woke, the attack on immigration, the work from home, the repeat about the deportations to the point where they could claim that they were actually running the immigration policy, Palestine. All those elements were things that they got from Trump, and it looked like that was going to be the case. But as I said, you can see I'll go back to Germany. I mean, I think in the case of Germany, I'll come back to the Labor Party because really the discussion is going to, I think we need to have a discussion about what it actually does mean, what it does mean here. But I don't think that's impossible to overstate, the shock of and the political consequences of seeing the AFD, get the kind of vote, that it got in Germany. I mean, the idea that in Germany, of all places, you could actually see pretty much the open fascist party become, the second party of the German Parliament, is absolutely, astounding. And perhaps what was equally astounding was to see the way in which Trump and Musk in particular to the AFD conference beforehand actually made very, very explicit connections between Trump's election and the AFD in Germany. Musk in terms of his talked about you need to be proud to be German. We need to put the history of Germany behind us. The AFD is the answer to multiculturalism in Germany. I mean, the thing was horrific, and it echoed very strongly, almost in the same words that some of the open fascists inside the AFD had actually used. Bernie Hocker, I'm not quite sure I pronounced that correctly, but his one of the things he talks about is what a shame it is to the German nation that there should be a memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin, and we have to the AFD and Germany needs to put that history behind us. And I think the other element that even in working class areas, the fact that the working class vote for the AFD was around 5% in 2017. It's around 38%, in 2025. So it's an indication, of the danger, that's involved. But then particularly we need to see where that actually come from. And to do that, you do need to look at at social democracy, at the failure of social democracy in Germany, and the way in which the mainstream politics in Germany had created the conditions for the right to be able to grow in the way it has. So in the lead up to the elections, and I mean not just in the lead up to the elections, but the SPD had presided over a whole period of declining German capitalism, was on the verge of recession, marginal recession, over the last few years, the circumstances for workers, the cost of living crisis, which we're all, very much aware of. But the SPD presided, over that. And then in the run-up to the election, you saw them repeating the same kind of arguments about immigration. So repeating the kinds of things that the problems of German capitalism could be sheeted home to immigrants. In that sense, simply legitimising the kind of arguments that the AFD had been making. And I think as part of that background, even you look at the war in Ukraine, the genocide, in Gaza, the way in which the SPD had positioned themselves, cracking down, bolstering, bolstering imperialism, bolstering imperialism, cracking down on Palestinian, demonstrations inside Germany. Again, it simply had reinforced all those elements that the AFD came to represent or embody, if you like. So that the experience of the SPD and the crisis in German capitalism had created the circumstance in which the AFD could benefit in the way it had. And I think even beyond that, and people probably are familiar, the Christian Democrats broke what was called, the firewall, the fact that, the mainstream parties would never collaborate with the far right in terms of the German Parliament. That firewall was broken by, the Christian Democrats when they relied upon the votes of the AFD to push through an anti-immigration bill, inside the German Parliament. So in that respect, which is not just that it created those circumstances, but it's normalised the AFD. It's created, legitimised it as a reasonable and respectable, acceptable party in Germany. And I think in that respect, it is just one example. You could look at Hungary, you could look at Austria, you could look at France, obviously, where the kind of the shift to the right in Europe is very, very palpable. I mean, the Le Pen, notwithstanding the court decisions, she may well use that court decision not be able to run to actually in the same way Trump used the fact that it's been persecuted by the system, trying to do some more bolstering. But the fact is that Le Pen is now actually ahead, and the very great concern that if there was an election, if you look at the polls at the moment, Le Pen is well ahead in terms of being the National Rally, party is in the head as far as the French. If there was to be a French election, as you know, it's an unstable situation in France anyway. We might hear a bit more of that from our comrade from Carnegie later. So it's an example, I think, of Germany as an example of what's happened, much more generally. So mostly I wanted to talk about Labor here because I think we can see the same kind of political development that we've seen in Europe actually developing, and we haven't got anything like the far right in Australia. But what we have got is a Labor Party which has got no answers to capitalist crisis, which has now shackled itself to American imperialism, which has been as pro-Israel as it wants to be, merely mouthed about anything. It won't condemn Trump about Gaza, new Gaza real estate. It won't commit to arresting Netanyahu. When France came out in terms of the latest developments and talked about two states, Albanese wouldn't commit himself to two states. So and all those other things about the cost of living that we've experienced is exactly the same kind of thing in terms of what the circumstances that so we may not see Dutton in the next election, but all the things which Labor had done to legitimise the right when Dutton went on the offensive about deportations and the criminals that in the migrant community community, Labor was very, very quick, to be the party which pushed through, that legislation to try and outflank, Dutton from the right to push those two through. So I want to see similar kinds of examples of where they're singing from the same song sheet to even though the question of migration, Labor went along with the idea that it's migrants and international students which is creating the crisis in housing. So we're seeing in that respect very a similar kind of development with as far as Labor's as far as the Labor Party here is concerned. And I think that's going to be a particular, a little prediction in that respect, but I think we are most likely to face a Labor government, and understanding that crisis in Labor, the weakness of the social democratic politics is important for how we continue to fight, because I think that there is no there's no sense in which Labor has got any kind of argument about any kind of policies about how to actually fundamentally change the system. It's not talked about anymore inside the Labor Party. If there was a socialist left, well, there was a socialist left inside the Labor Party, but now you've got the two parliamentary leaders, the leader and the deputy leader, actually the parliamentary lead of the socialist left are now leaders of the Labor Party. There's no sense in which there is a left dynamic inside the Labor Party that raises anything any consistent policies to push Labor to the left. And it's going to be one of the other examples is the administration of the CFMEU. That the fact that it was Labor that put the CFMEU into administration. It's very, very clear. I don't need to go over that in any detail, but it's very clear CFMEU is in administration. Its only crime is that it continues to fight on the job, militantly on the job, and is prepared to push the boundaries. I mean, it doesn't always. It's got a massive amount of fines for breaking the boundaries, but it's been Labor which has actually put the CFMEU into administration. And I think that experience, the fact is over the last 3 years, I think the left has by and large been, disarmed in many respects about how to fight Labor and a willingness to fight Labor. So much of whether it's the movements or inside the unions, it's been a matter of thinking, we've got Labor in power, we can, negotiate with them, get our feet under the table, we can lobby Labor, perhaps that will shift things, that might be enough to actually shift things. And there's been a few crumbs that Labor has flicked off the table in that respect. But you can also see why the Muslim vote in Western Sydney, there's a reason that it's a resonance for the Muslim vote. There's a reason why for many people look at Labor and Liberal and don't see any particular difference, because the experience of the cost of living, the experience of COVID, the experience in Labor in power over Palestine and everything else makes them look exactly does make them look exactly the same. In the response to the CFMEU, the fact that we saw so many unions go along with the administration of the CFMEU, the ACT would go along with the CFMEU. The administration of the CFMEU is another kind of indication that now, even for the union movement, it's a question of what kind of crumbs we can get from the Labor Party, not about actual struggle, not about mobilising unions to fight for what's needed to address the cost of living crisis or the housing crisis or about Gaza, about Gaza or anything else. So I think there are some parallels, I think, with the circumstances and that Rosa Luxemburg kind of wrote about at the turn of the last century, in the lead up to the war. The arguments with social democracy, her arguments with the SPD at the time between reform and revolution. At that time, the argument with the reformists was effectively that capitalism was going to expand. It was able to grow. It was going to peacefully develop. It would be able to be slow, gradual, transformation. It would overcome, the crises, that Marx had argued was intrinsic, to the capitalist economy. So her argument very much was with that kind of idea, that actually no crisis was embedded in capitalism. The militarism was a consequence of that. That we need to talk about revolutionary challenge to capitalism, not about slow gradual reform. I mean, we don't necessarily put a date on when that shifts, but it's certainly the social democracy doesn't talk any longer. That's not the argument about crisis in capitalism is not an argument any longer. They accept that there's crisis in capitalism. Their argument now is not that capitalism is can be peacefully transformed. Their argument now is that it's uncontrollable. There isn't any alternative to the market. All we can do is try and nibble, mitigate the consequences, nibble, at the edges. And in that regard, I think the kind of shock that we're going through with Trump. I mean, no one would have expected that the rules-based order was going to be overturned in quite the way that it has been. But in that respect, all the certainties that has gone on previously have been thrown up into the air. And in those circumstances, the inability of social democracy to address those things is absolutely critical. I mean, the uncertainty that's associated with politics, the fact that things could shift so far to the right, that you've got the President of the United States who looks and sounds like an old imperialist. We don't do it by niceties now of talking to people, having nice chats in the White House, putting those policies in place. And now we're talking much more about naked US power to push those things through. And in those circumstances, there's a backdrop, I think, for social democracy is that the turmoil that's in the world politics. And in 1904, Luxemburg wrote about that that the powerful rise of world politics in the last 10 years has dragged the entire economic and social life of capitalist countries into a maelstrom of immense, uncontrollable international effects, conflicts, and reorganisation. Now, it could have been written in 2024, certainly in 2025, and that is the backdrop in which we're going to see a Labor government subsequently. And I think that's what's important about where Labor situates itself. Labor can't criticise Trump because it's shackled to US imperialism. It can't criticise Trump because it supports AUKUS. It can't criticise Trump because that's been a critical way. That AUKUS has been a critical way in which the Labor Party talks about reorganising Australian capitalism, of building jobs. All those other measures that are talked about. That's that Labor has got itself in that in that kind of position. And you can see also the consequences of looking to the system, of working with the system even on the Greens. I mean, the fact that David Shoebridge could come out and talk about, for the Greens, for the first time, we've got a defence policy. Now, it's only $4 billion, but there's more to come, says David Shoebridge. But there's a reason, that they have made peace in that respect. They have accommodated, to the system as an indication of the same kind of, crisis that I've, same kind of crisis that I discussed earlier. And I think the general situation of world capitalism, let alone Australian capitalism, I mean, there is every chance that we will go into recession. That the consequences of the tariffs and the trade upheavals that Trump has initiated, will see a slowdown in China, will see a slowdown in the world economy, and that rather than being able to live off the question of the exports to China in the way Australian capitalism has, we're likely to see circumstances much more like perhaps like the 80s, without being too dramatic about it. We can already see ways in which the system is not able to deliver. There's a reason why there's an uptick in strike days lost. But the reason is that the bosses aren't so willing to grant pay increases. So whereas in if you looked at the last round of enterprise bargaining, mostly those claims were won with 1 or 2 days, sometimes with no days lost. There's many more places that are having to go on strike, that are having to take kind of action, even to extract very minimal wage increases. There's nowhere, even the big battalions of Australian industry, leave aside the fact they've beheaded the CFMEU, but have not won real 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 wage increases. So I think that's also an indication of just the fat in the system, the capacity of Labor to be able to offer reforms, etc., to be able for there to be to buy off discontent is more and more limited, and that is why we are seeing the disillusionment, we are seeing the discontent, which in other places has been pulled to the right. Our job here is to make sure that it's not pulled to the right, that we need to build a left to the Labor Party. We need to be a left that's going to be able to intervene in all the political struggles that are no doubt are coming up. Even little small ways. I mean, people would have noticed the steelworks in South Australia that they've been nationalised. Now, that's very small measure has been forced on. The Labor Party doesn't crow about that. It's, yes, we've nationalised the steel industry to make sure there's jobs. There's a reason for that they don't crow about it, because they don't want it raised anywhere else where it's where it's an issue. The argument that we make in the renewable energy industry, for example, why there needs to be state investment if there's going to be the kind of renewable energy and that is going to make for the possible for not only just a just transition for the workers, but a transition to renewable energy in the context of the climate crisis. The North Shore Hospital in Sydney has been going back into public hands because privatisation didn't work. The New South Wales government has actually put legislation that there won't be any more public, private arrangements because of the failure of the North Shore Hospital. They're small indications of that, that the general crisis in the system, that we've talked about. So I think that, and I think one of the other things which just mentioned before we finish, I think is the importance about raising the politics in the context of those struggles. I mean, some of the, even in the AFD, in Germany, one of the experiences was that one of the arguments was that you don't really need to raise the question of explicit anti-racist politics, pro-migrant politics in the context of workers' struggles. We need to just talk about the economic struggle. That's going to be enough to shift things. That's what workers want to hear. But there's one of the consequences of that is that the politics necessary to actually fight those things. When you've got the ruling class talking about the problem is the migrants, not the boss. The people need to understand. The working class needs to understand that the problem is the boss, not the migrants. That the migrants are part of the solution, not part of the problem, and to actively fight that, fight the racism, pull people into the struggle. So I think that whatever we see with when Labor's re-elected. If it is re-elected, we're probably going to get a minority Labor government, but none of those issues are going to, go away. People here, I look around the room. A lot of people are already aware of how many jobs are going to go in higher education. That's going to be well element of the fight. Labor's got nothing to say about the horror, in Gaza. It's still shackled, to the question of workers. And in those circumstances, I think there's a way of actually pulling, the politics and economics, economics together. I mean, we raise all the time about one submarine equals, how many jobs. One submarine equals, how many hospitals. Now, it can be just a glib economic argument. The money's there. We can one submarine is the way in which we could pay for all the jobs in higher education, or the money for the NDIS and so forth. But I think if we expand that argument, there's a reason why that one submarine, why the Labor Party is tied to that submarine. It is a question of Australia's connection to imperialism. It is a question of its unwillingness to confront either the US or in Gaza or anywhere else. There's a way of pulling those those arguments together to talk about what kind of fight, what kind of alternatives that we need. There's no doubt that we're going into very turbulent time. We're going, and in terms of world politics, the way in which those world politics will have an impact here. We're going to face a Labor government, likely Labor government, which has got no particular answers, and in circumstances in which the necessity, all that, the cost of living, all the rest of it are going to be just as urgent and just important as they were before. And in those circumstances, it means every little bit of struggle is actually critical to building a socialist vision, to be building an organisation that's capable of intervening in those bits of struggle. Why it's a struggle is absolutely critical, not just to change the system, but it's in that process of struggle where people begin to understand the system, become open to wider ideas about the alternatives, to build a genuine capitalist alternative. And I think that's what we can look forward to. We can see what's happening. We need to take what's happening in the world stage very, very, very seriously in terms of the consequence that it has if there isn't a fight against the system. We're not talking anymore about the capacity of the system to deliver. We're looking very, very conscious, very deliberately, very consciously at a system which is going into crisis. And in those circumstances, we need to be everywhere arguing for all the measures that need to be taken. Revolutionaries are the best fighters for reforms. We're the best fighters for reforms because we understand the way in which the system is sick. It's not capable of delivering. To understand those things, how you fight the boss, why you need to fight the system, is the way in which you're actually going to build that kind of alternative. And that's what we are going to need to fight the far right, and that will take up measures of solidarity with those struggles around the world. But the best way we have to do it here is to make sure that the kind of politics about a genuine alternative to the crisis in capitalism, the explicit arguments for socialism and revolution are raised in every workplace, every school, every university.